believe we're live. So let me first welcome everybody to this webinar titled Is IPv4 a Commodity? My name is Serge Radovcic. I'm the IPXO advisory board member, and I'm going to be moderating the discussion for today. So we see that due to what seems seemingly limited supply and increasing demand for IPv4 addresses, they're becoming more and more desirable. But what has led to this demand and what has led to IPv4 becoming a commodity, if it is, after our discussion? Will this resource remain a commodity in the future? Where's the market going? And what aspects might affect it? So we thought we'd try and answer some of these questions, probably more. Maybe we'll go a bit off track, we'll see how it goes. And in attempting to do so, we've gathered a small group of panelists that have experience and knowledge in this area. So joining us live is Gabe Fried, CEO of Hilco Stream Bank from the States, a little way from Gabe. Nick Winters, partner at Moore Kingston Smith in the UK. Hi, Nick. And Vincentas Grinius, CEO of the IPXO platform for leasing IP4 address space. Hi, Vincentas. And we did have Geoff Huston, the chief scientist of AP, Nick, was going to come on live, but due to a couple of other clashes and the fact that it's 3 o'clock in the morning in Australia, I believe he's sound asleep at the moment. However, he was nice enough to deliver us a pre-recorded talk for about 15 minutes, which I'm going to get us to play a little bit after we get into the discussion. He's just to talk a little bit about how we got to this place and where he sees things going in the future. So Geoff will have his pre-recorded videos. So, okay, just to start this off and following along from some of the questions we've got there, I thought we'd take a look at some of the accounting practices and the financial aspects of it. Perhaps, Nick, I can start with you. Are IPv4 addresses as a commodity, and how are they seen from an accounting perspective in the UK and Europe?
Yeah. So as just so some of you, I don't know where you all are, but I'm based in the UK. But I know from a conversation with Gabe that the US treatment is very similar. In the UK, these IPv4 assets are a little bit unusual in that many companies that hold them don't actually pay the $40, $50 what they're currently paying out to acquire them. They become members of the various regions, and then they are allocated those addresses, and they can use them as much and as long as they like, as long as they keep being members effectively. So generally what happens in the balance sheets and profit and loss accounts of these companies is that we don't see them on the balance sheet. So unless you've actually paid your $50 for your thousands or millions of IPv4 addresses, you see nothing on the balance sheets. And I was just looking actually at some of the biggest holders of IPv4 addresses in the UK, and some of them have got tens of millions of addresses worth many hundreds of millions of pounds, and there's not even a mention of them in the kind of notes to say we have the rights to 20 million IPv4 addresses which are worth £1 billion. And even in these large companies, that would be quite interesting. So what generally people do is they will just expense the annual cost of those, and they will have nothing at all on their balance sheet. So it's an interesting asset, an interesting asset in that, does the balance sheet make sense without having any recognition whatsoever of these, and should there be some disclosure? And very few companies seem to be disclosing very much about them or even making mention of them.
So when they are being recorded, I assume they're being recorded as an intangible asset. If so, is there a common amortization period? And how is this calculated if there is one?
Yeah, so I've seen. I also kind of did a little trawl of some of the companies that have those on their balance sheet, and it's only obviously the only companies that have it on their balance sheet are those that have acquired them. So unless you acquired them, you don't have them on your balance sheet at all. But where they've acquired them, they are generally writing them off over a period that ranges from 3 to 10 years, but also indefinite lives as well, because I think there are people going, we had this conversation separately, how long is an IPv4 address going to have some value? How long is it going to last for? It seems that some people are still thinking that's going to be indefinite. But between 3 and 10 years is the most common practice that I've seen. I also saw, interestingly, that one or two companies have begun to revalue those assets. So they're buying them for $10 or $20 if they've had them for a while, and then they're revaluing them up in their accounts up to $50 to make the balance sheet look better, which seems quite a rare treatment at the moment. But that also seems to be allowed. So I think there's not a lot of commonality at all in terms of disclosure, recognition. So it's very different across the board.
Okay. So what we have seen in the U.S. is very similar. I would add that I did, after at some point earlier this year, a keyword search in the Security Exchange Commission's filings database for IPv4, and the only reporting that I found was in one-time revenue reporting for public companies that had sold IP addresses. So they would, it's outside of the ordinary course of their business. We, reported a sale of whatever amount of addresses at whatever price, and we have this additional, revenue, which they're recording as revenue, not as a gain on an asset sale. So, but I think that the overarching theme is that the finance and accounting standards people have not actually agreed on how these should be treated.
So do they use, let's say, the format of intellectual property? Would this be the closest thing that they're trying to compare it to when putting it on their books?
Yeah, I think so. But as you say, it is kind of the intellectual property rules that we would follow in the UK. So for intellectual property, internally generated intellectual property cannot be recognised on your balance sheet. And IPv4 addresses, kind of by their nature, you're paying to be a member, so you can't recognise that asset on your balance sheet. You're not permitted to. So I think there is a lot of similarity in the way that intellectual property would be recognised. So and then again, how long? What's the long life of intellectual property? Again, is another very difficult question to answer. There's no correct answer. But that's true. And obviously this has impact on kind of earnings and valuations and return on capital, all those kind of things, etc. That you would try and use to compare companies to. They're all doing different things, and it's quite difficult to compare companies that have very significant valuable rights because they're not really disclosing what those are, and it's quite difficult to compare company to company.
Right. So either for Gabe or Nick, from a tax authority point of view, do they recognise them in any way? Are they interested? Do they understand? Have there been issues that either of you have had to deal with?
I mean, HMRC certainly do not understand what they are. I mean, I think I've had conversations with lenders who don't understand what they are. So I think HMRC certainly don't understand what they are. And I think unless they appear somewhere in the balance sheet as an asset and get sold, they're not particularly interested. So they might have a very valuable company with tens of thousands or millions of IP addresses at their disposal, but the revenue won't be aware that there's something tucked in there that could be of immense value, because they're only going to see the numbers which get reported on the returns and flag them by the normal means, which will not include the IPv4 address value potentially.
We have not seen any interaction with the tax authorities in terms of treatment. I think that Nick is right. This isn't on anybody's radar screen in a meaningful way. What we have seen, at least in one case, was a use of an all assets lien for a company that had borrowed money, where the borrower was able to use the IP addresses as part of their collateral. So I think there's a question about, those things are not recorded, for example, in the, where the rest of the registration information is recorded. So it's not like a patent or a trademark where you can record an assignment to a lender subject to a loan agreement, that mechanism doesn't exist yet anyway with IPv4. But the market is still young.
Yeah. So, talking about either writing it off as an asset or an expense, and, I get there's the running costs if you're leasing. That's pretty easy. If you're a member of one of the IRRs, you might write that cost off. But if someone's purchasing some of these IPv4 addresses, perhaps if they're only buying 10,000 K versus if they're spending tens of millions, would some of them just be writing that 10K off as a expense for the year?
I mean, they shouldn't be, because I think they should be recognizing it as a long, medium-term asset, and it should be on the balance sheet. If you're buying them for the many tens of dollars that they now trade for, then you should be putting them on your balance sheet. They have a value. They have a longevity. Whatever that might be, you might have to argue how long it's going to last for, the use of it, but it's got a long life, so it should be sitting on your balance sheet as an intangible asset.
Right. I think the only sort of unanswered question is the amortization period.
Yeah.
But if you're buying, it's an asset, so you should treat it as such.
So if the tax authorities don't get it, they don't understand it. What about in the scenario where an organization, perhaps their legacy address space holders, they've never really recorded this as an asset in any way, and then they sell it potentially, depending on how much space we're talking about, a couple of $100 million. How do they justify this magical turn up of a couple of $100 million on their books?
Yeah, I think sadly, certainly in the UK, HMRC are not too bothered if you turn up with 200 million of taxable profits, etc. So it's not a question they'd ask, really. So they're quite grateful particularly in current circumstances, quite grateful to receive the tax and won't ask any questions. So I think it's almost, but it's like some of those companies, some of the largest holders of rights are listed entities, and in some ways, you're doing the shareholders a disservice by not allowing them to know that tucked away inside your company is this very valuable asset, which does have a value. I mean, it's easy to work out how many you have and what the current value is broadly, and a little bit of disclosure, like we've got 10 million of these things. They're currently trading at X dollars, and on that basis, we've got $500 million worth of these that are available to us. And I suppose for some companies, maybe they're not making good enough use of that, because Chris, if you had a £500 million asset sitting on your balance sheet and you were making £10 million, perhaps your shareholders would go, why are you only making £10 million? So maybe that's one of the reasons why there's a bit of reticence to disclose that information.
So it's a very good point, and I think that if I were knowing what I know now, if I were an equities analyst, I would look at the databases of registered holders of IP addresses, see which ones are listed companies, and see whether or not I can make bets based on sort of some kind of a valuation model that doesn't account for what they're actually holding. But what it doesn't tell you is whether or not they're actually using them. So you have to go a step further, right? This discussion, at least so far, is what happens if you have these on your balance sheet, but you're not actually using them. And if you go talk to some of the big listed companies that have large holdings of addresses, they will tell you, like, we actually do use these. So it's not that they could readily sell them tomorrow for whatever the price is behind me, $50 an address. Have the cash and then get on with their lives. Like, many of them would actually have to do work to actually realize that.
But I think if you were, sort of on the other hand to that, if you were a company that was, trundling along with, a large number of these IP addresses, and you're a shareholder and trundling along making a very small profit, I think I'll be within my rights as a shareholder to say, guys, you've got £50 million worth of IP addresses. Why don't you just stop doing what you're doing, sell those, and go and do something else? I think if I had that information, that's probably where I'd be coming if I were a shareholder. And if I was a knowledgeable director or CEO of one of those companies, I probably should be thinking the same thing.
Sure.
I do have one question I saw come in from Jack Hazan. He asks, is treatment different if the company charges customers for dedicated IPv4 addresses?
So it's the same. It's the same IP leasing structure, where you make revenue out of the IP addresses, but from different principles of the revenue. So yeah, perhaps it's a question for Nick.
Yeah, but no, it's almost whatever you do with them is irrelevant, sort of sadly in a way, because it doesn't make any difference to the accounting treatment. Whatever you're doing with them, they get treated in the same way. So yeah.
Just one more question on the accounting aspect, perhaps to Gabe, because I know you've got some experience. What about Chapter 11 and bankruptcy cases? Is there a trend that the assets are now more readily recognized by the person or the organization running the insolvency?
Yes, not necessarily on the first day of the insolvency proceeding, but firms like ours are usually quick to point out when these companies have these assets. And in these insolvency proceedings, and there are mechanical differences in the way insolvency works between the US, for example, and Canada and the UK, but the general approach to insolvency is basically the same, which is whether or not the company can reorganize its finances to continue operating, or does it have to liquidate? And in the event that it can raise funds from selling IP addresses, you don't need to be in bankruptcy to do that. But that's a great way to generate cash if you're not using those assets, right? It's essentially like found money. And if you liquidate, then the creditor entities who are the stakeholders in that liquidation will want you to maximize the selling price of every asset. So that could be, your office furniture, it could be your equipment, it could be your, real property, and also your IP addresses. So it's certainly becoming, the number of address holders, right, in general is not that large relative to the number of corporations globally. But when those address holders end up in bankruptcy, like almost without question, their IP addresses are getting sold in the event of a liquidation, or they're even possibly getting valued in the event of a bankruptcy acquisition that takes those addresses, because the buyer will have to allocate its purchase price across the assets. And if you know that those assets are there, then they're going to be ascribed some value.
But Gabe, maybe it's a question for later on. But what kind of liquidity is there? In fact, if I was to, as a liquidator or as a company, say, I've got 500,000 or 10 million of these. What can the market stand? How does it operate in that way?
The market's incredibly liquid. It takes a little bit of time, so anywhere from 1 or 2 weeks to 4 or 5 weeks to get a transfer approved by a registry of a qualified recipient. But the market's very liquid. The addresses move very quickly. It's principally a function of asking price and whether or not you have access to sort of the buyer community. So, but for the most part, you can, easily inside 30 days time, you can convert your address holdings into funds in your bank account. It's and regardless of block size. So it's just as easy to move a small block of 256 addresses as it is to move, a block of 1 million. The buyers are different, but everybody needs the addresses, right? There's this huge amount of unmet demand, and so it's pretty easy to sell these.
Okay. So what I might do now is move on, and I think it might partially answer one of the questions I saw just come in from Diego, is how we got to this stage. And so I might ask if we can play Geoff's video now, just while they're setting that up, if I get cut off. Okay, I think we'll get into it. We'll have a look at a little bit of at least the way Geoff's explaining how we got to where we are now and some of his views on where we might be going. So I'll hand over to Geoff. I think I have to press play, and here he comes.
Good afternoon, everyone, or I assume it's afternoon. My name's Geoff Huston. I'm the Chief Scientist at APNIC, the Regional Internet Registry serving in Asia Pacific. Thanks for having me here today, but you might have noticed this is a recording. I'm not here. Part of the problem of the world being a sphere is that not everyone's in the same time zone. And if you're trying to hold an event where you're dragging people from all over the world, somebody has to draw the short straw and get the 3 a.m. time slot. And it's my turn. Now, there are many things I could say at 3 a.m. in the morning, but none of them are worth listening to. Frankly, I don't function at that hour. And maybe the best way out of this is to me to time shift myself and actually share some thoughts with you in a recorded presentation and leave it up to the other panelists to figure out what I said and pick up the mess and see if there's any insights in here. So rather than, as I said, share some incoherent middle of the night ramblings, I thought I would actually share with you some thoughts around IP address markets and their formation and activities in about 10 minutes or so, possibly a little bit less. So let's start. The first thing I think I want to say is that today was never, ever, ever meant to happen. The reality we're in was not a reality that was intended. It was never meant to escape from the lab, this internet experiment. It was always an experiment. The adults that weren't in the room were meant to come and save us and say, those are very fine ideas, you internet lads. Let's turn it into a massive global service. It wasn't meant to be the service. And even if it was, the infrastructure elements, particularly the naming and addressing arrangements, weren't meant to be part of that package because they were never, ever, ever going to scale. They were never going to be part of an environment that was of a truly awesome, scaled up, billions, if not trillions of device, massive silicon network. The internet wasn't built for that. It was an experiment in how to do it, not the answer, this is the way we're going to do it. Why not? Because it won't scale. Now, when I say it won't scale, oddly enough, it did scale in 2 out of the 3 major dimensions. And sometimes we say to ourselves, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. But in this case, 2 out of 3 is not enough. We looked at the routing system. And we had real concerns about trying to stuff millions, hundreds of millions, billions of names into the routing system. Now, oddly enough, that hasn't been a real concern. We've done it. But we've done it only by maintaining a strict hierarchy, not by having billions of words at the top level of the DNS hierarchy, but by imposing a hierarchy. We've actually made the DNS contain massive numbers of items of information, searchable in time spans that you don't notice. Now, let me just put a footnote here that the efforts by ICANN to reopen this topic and ultimately fatten the namespace into a single level namespace will completely destroy the utility, performance, and the intrinsic value of the DNS. Obviously, those efforts have an ultimate outcome of going, wow, we've broken the DNS. But that's almost a parenthetic conversation. It's not this one. So let's get back to the other 2. And the first of these is the routing system. Because again, if we thought about a really, really big network in the late 1980s, part of the issue was routers were a problem and the routing algorithm was a problem. How could we scale it? Now, Moore's law has come to our salvation here. And while the routers of today are vastly bigger than the routers of 1990, Moore's law has said that the unit cost of routing hasn't actually shifted all that much. It's possibly cheaper. So in some ways, we can build more silicon and push it into the routing issue and route this because the technologies have actually scaled quite gently. And the cost of routing is not a dominant factor in anybody's ledger book. So oddly enough, scaling the routing system hasn't been the gigantic problem we thought it was in 1990. 2 out of 3. Addresses, however, not so. And it was even obvious then. We just didn't have a way out with IPv4. And so the efforts of the first sort of half of the 1990s was to figure out what the way out really was. And the way we decided was to do a very, very minimal change. We took the fixed length, finite, 32-bit wide address fields in v4 and made them 4 times larger in bits, 128 bits. Now that's not making the address space 4 times larger. It's making it larger by a factor of 2 to the power 96, which is, a big number. And the issue was it was kind of comparing 2 rooms. We're in a very finite room where it was obvious, even in 1991 or so, the room wasn't going to be big enough for much longer. There was vastly more silicon being produced. We had addresses to address them all. And 2 to the power 128 was this massive room somewhere over there, which would obviously address all these issues. We wouldn't solve the address crunch, but we'd defer it way beyond our lifetime. Now, we could envisage it, we could define it, but how to get from here to there, that was the big issue. Because what we wanted to do was avoid giving away the last IPv4 address. Our thinking had progressed. We weren't the experiment anymore. There wasn't going to be a last day of the internet, now let's go do something else for real. The internet was now seen as being the solution. And so we had to now adjust everything about this experiment to avoid giving away that last IPv4 address. And so what we did was actually put in place some administrative measures to slow down the address consumption rate, and by slowing down the inefficiency of its use. And in some ways, that was the motivation behind the building of the regional internet registries. The idea that we could impose some small ongoing cost of address ownership and some administrative issue to actually look at the issues of demonstrated need as distinct from completely unconstrained expressions of need. And through this, dampen the levels of consumption. Now, that wasn't meant to be permanent. It was really an issue to buy us enough time to get us into the v6 room. This was all about getting time to deploy v6. Because again, even in 1992, 93, 94, it was pretty clear that flag days weren't going to work and that it would take some time to get IPv6 deployed. Because not only is it all your routers and all your infrastructure in the network, every single device needed to have its own brain transplant. And as we kept on building more end devices, we called them PCs to start with, and then came laptops, and oh my God, then came the iPhone. All of a sudden, the number of devices that needed this transplant were growing faster than our ability to do that. And so this idea that we needed, maybe a year or two became, maybe 5 years, and became, oh God, we don't know. So the whole idea of this system of damping demand was to buy us time so that we never had to give away the last v4 address. We were meant to have completed the transition before we got into v4 crunch land. But, we didn't, because 2011 came, the IANA ran out of its own IPv4 stocks, then APNIC, then the RIRs one by one ran out of almost everything. A dry IPv4 address exhaustion happened and demand hadn't stopped because we were still addicted to v4. So inevitably aftermarkets formed. New needs were met through transfer. Scarcity is now addressed as a market pricing function. And the real question now is how long will these markets last? Because it's pretty clear this market will endure for as long as there's IPv4 services and IPv4 clients. Now, if you talked to us in 94, we would have said, 3 to 5 years. But that was 1994. And 2011 came, and we're now 2021, looking at 2022, 11 years after exhaustion. And we have no idea how long this is going to last. So that's a really good question. How long will this market last? And the answer is nobody knows. Why does nobody know? Because NATs, because network address translators. We'll see what they meant, But the issue is it allowed us to vastly improve the efficiency of IPv4 addresses. We took a 32-bit address field and added 16 bits of source port number and 16 bits of destination port number. Geez, that's another 32 bits. Now, it might not give us a full deck of 64 bits of addressing capability, but it's enough to have bought us a lot of time. Now, time is at the essence of this entire conversation. Because if we're talking about leasing versus buying in IPv4 addresses, it's actually all about these numbers of time. If you think that this is a long-term situation, that it will last for some considerable time, counting in units of decades perhaps, and that this scarcity function will increase over time, then the value of the asset, which is reflected as a scarcity function, will increase over time as the scarcity pressure increases. If that's the case, then buying the asset makes financial sense, as someone will tell you in any other commodity. If, on the other hand, you think that NATs will continue to be more and more effective, then the value will remain largely constant, as it did from about 2011 when the markets first appeared until, about 2018, when the price of the asset was relatively steady. Why? Because that scarcity was released or relieved through the increased pressure of NATs. At that point, buying versus leasing, the asset's maintaining value, there is an uncertainty risk. If I'm wrong and we're in this for a long haul, I should have bought. But if I'm wrong and this is a short-term proposition, I should lease. Why? Because if you really think this is a short-term issue and V4 has a visible endpoint and it's soon in terms of not months, maybe years, then like DECnet of previous era, the value of V4 will plummet to zero. No one wants it. If no one wants it, it has no value. Leasing makes sense because no one wants to be left with the stranded, valueless asset on their books. So this is a conversation about time. Let's talk about how long it takes to bring in V6 from today. But is that the right conversation? Is that the only conversation? What else could supplant the need for globally unique IPv4 addresses? And the answer really lies in somewhere over there, which is actually the rise of content distribution networks and the death of transit, because we don't share anymore. Those content distribution networks operate and own their own transmission facilities. They don't feed their data centers across the public internet. They feed their data centers across their own private networks. I don't need packet-based multiplexing for sharing. And if I don't need packet-based multiplexing for sharing, both in the CDNs and even in the broadband fiber networks, where I'm using virtual circuits based on passive optical network multiplexing, based on wavelengths, basically. If I don't need to share, I don't need unique addresses anymore, because that's not the primary mechanism of sharing. And so the death of transit is actually a really big thing, because what it means is the NATs that were seen as edge devices that sat in your home and transformed a whole bunch of appliances and PCs in your home to one external address you presented to your ISP, now becomes a device at the other end of the access ISP, where that scarcity has pushed NATs into what we call carrier-grade NATs, where the entire operator's ISP network sits behind a NAT. And those cost and performance pressures have brought CDNs to abut against the access networks. There's nothing in between. There's no transit. Content sits at the edge of the access networks. So here's the thought experiment. What happens when the NAT, which abuts into the CDN, shifts over and moves into the CDN? What happens when the CDN intrudes into the access ISP? Do you even need a NAT? Can I reuse global addresses in different locations? If I'm sitting here connected to a access data center here in Canberra, and you're connected to one in, I don't know, Brussels, Madrid, Paris, can we both be called Net10? And the answer is, well, of course you can, because my client network number is irrelevant to the one you're using. And sure, we can both use the same one because you and I never talk. We're just talking to the local data center. So this is not just about V6. It's actually about a transformation of the architecture and addressing in terms of leasing versus buying, which is a discussion about time, is a difficult discussion. The current situation is unstable, but its resolution is equally uncertain. Why should we revive a 1980s architecture using a 1970s technology platform, otherwise known as V6, as the answer to the next century's worth of communications needs? Is this idea of packet-based multiplexing and sharing really relevant in a world of abundance in terms of transmission? Or are we going to leverage that abundance and rely on a continuation of the client-server model that we adopted in the face of scarcity that actually turned out to be phenomenally effective? The internet today that we've built doesn't use transit. It positions all the services and all of the transactions right up against the customer, in which case we don't need globally unique addresses anymore. And if this is an argument about time, it's the time between the ascendancy of either of those models. There may be others, but I'm just not sure what they might be. But this then brings in the real issue here and the level of discomfort about this debate. And you could call it even a debate about IP versus Bitcoin. Because the folk who argued against a market in IPv4 addresses were not arguing against economic rationalism. What they wanted was to avoid a market that created uncertainty for investment in upper layer digital goods and services. They wanted addresses to be a stable commodity that was a platform for other activities, not the subject of speculation, not a choke point in its own right. But how do you avoid addresses being a choke point? You've got to make them limitless. And we don't know how to do that in IP. In environments of finite resources and potentially unlimited demand, then speculative pressures inevitably arise. And that cost of speculative pressure becomes a cost inside this equation of what to do with addresses. And what does all this mean for this panel and this debate? Well, if we're talking about strategies on how to optimize your position, I need addresses, but for how long? The only observation I can offer of any value is that, like Bitcoin, IP addresses have an intrinsic value based on their perception of scarcity until they don't. Thank you.
Okay, so that was the little segment that Geoff sent to us to give us his view on sort of how we got there and what might impact the prices or the needs in the future. Perhaps before we get into some of the bits that Geoff brought up, just to take us back a little to how we got there, Gabe, from my if I remember correctly, the first official transfers that were associated with some monetary exchange for IPv4 addresses happened in about 2010 to 11. And back then it was between about $8-10 US per IP address. We didn't see things change much for the years that Geoff was talking about through to 2018-19. They slowly went up steadily, maybe hit the $20 US mark after almost 10 years. And then all of a sudden, around 18 months ago, took a sharp turn up to the right. And now they've more than doubled in that 18-month period to probably something close to $50. Do you see any reasons why this happened? Could this possibly be attributed to the pandemic period?
So it's a good question. So if you look back historically, so your recollection is roughly correct. In 2011 and 12, there were some fairly large block sales. Nortel to Microsoft in Nortel's bankruptcy, a transaction from Borders Books, which was a U.S. book retailer, to a medical records company, which was in bankruptcy. And the nice thing about bankruptcies is the transactions are public, so you can look at them and look at the pricing. And they were all in the $10 to $12 range. And the pricing has sort of grown, if you will, more or less through the end of 2019, and then it flattened a bit for the next year. So And at the start of the pandemic, prices started to increase, and the rate of increase was fairly rapid. So we started last year. So let's say a year ago, January of 2020, prices were like in the low $20 range, and now they're in the $50 range. So they've actually more than doubled in less than 12 months.
Wow.
The question is why? And the answer sort of is a combination of the following. One is ultimately we don't actually know. The buyers are coming from everywhere. The sellers are coming from everywhere. We haven't seen, for example, like a wholesale shift geographically or by industry type in terms of who's buying addresses. The second one is the fact that these addresses have an incredibly unique attribute when compared to other commodities, which is that it's very difficult to buy them and then immediately resell them. And because the address purchaser, if you will, the purchaser of the rights to the addresses needs to demonstrate a commitment to utilize them. Every time a block of addresses sells, it essentially comes out of circulation. So we're seeing, and if Geoff were live, I would ask him to pull up, he has an IPv4 utilization chart, which shows you sort of the cumulative distribution of IPv4 utilization, and it's approaching the actual usable limit, right? So the number of addresses, if you exclude what's, of the 4.3 billion, the portion that's available for any cast, for example, then we're looking at close to 94, 95, 96% utilization. And with every passing month, more and more of these addresses become transacted, and more of them are essentially coming off of the market. That will create a price squeeze. I think this price squeeze is exacerbated a little bit by the idea that if you're watching the market and you see prices start to increase by a few percentage points over the course of a month, you start to ask yourself the question, well, if this was in my 3 or 4 or 5 year plan to get addresses, maybe I should do this now because I don't want to wait 6 or 8 or 12 months to get more addresses. And I think there's a lot of that is driving pricing. But at the end of the day, there's a business case to be made for $50 an address or more by all of the people who are currently paying $50 an address for address space. So there's real value to the organizations who are buying these, whether they're buying them to sort of lease them out or provide other services to customers, or if they are buying them for their own use to grow their network, or they are buying them for their own use so that they can avoid the cost of renting them from an upstream provider or a hosting company. And we see a lot of that in our marketplace.
Okay, so what about you, Vincent, on the leasing side of things? I guess, is there a correlation between what the buyers are paying and what people are leasing them for?
So leasing always comes second in terms of leasing pricing, but I would like to reflect a little bit on Geoff's notes that he made, and this is what we should think. Right now we are making things and building the things around the old technologies, and trying to kind of survive, being in the internet. And this is what, our idea is to basically, enable the IP sharing, no matter if you perhaps are IP holder, or if you are a small ISP that, has problems with CAPEX and you are capable on basically invest just a small portion of your revenue into the IP addresses. So leasing, of course, is also a rational option to go. But I do not want to discuss which one is better. It's all related to the financial constraints, and at the same time, I'm really a big supporter of of that idea that the business decisions, the economy that is building around, either IP buying or either IP leasing, should create the new technologies where we would, become more scalable, because there are many companies that, for example, are looking for millions of IP addresses, but they are not able to do that because, they would not be able to, for example, even finance those IP addresses if they are funded over VCs, private equity companies. So it's a really thing that we have to definitely focus on, and perhaps on focusing on that economy, and as Gabe said, distributing it and utilizing fully, we could unlock a new technologies that could unlock for us a new tomorrow.
So just before we get on to the future, I'm just also interested in current trends. Perhaps I can stick with you, Vincentas, while you're talking. What trends have you seen, if any, as far as regions or sectors go, that seem to be demanding the most lease space?
Yeah, so we all know iron and ripe, these are the most favorable ones. We know the issues with Afrinic, and actually not many of them on the market, but I see that Apinic is picking up, although iron and ripe remains the most popular ones in terms of the leasing market.
Okay, Gabe, do you have insights into the sectors that seem to be buying space recently?
So we've seen for a long time the hosting companies are acquiring addresses. This is everything from sort of fairly small localized hosting and web services companies all the way up to Amazon, and that has been fairly stable throughout our tenure in the marketplace, which now is going on 10 years or more. What we have started to see more recently is a shift in purchasing, where we're seeing many more public sector entities buying space. We see this principally in the US, but I think in large part because it's sort of the largest market of where public entities are essentially left to their own devices to figure out connectivity. And this is everything from state and local organizations, school systems, et cetera. And then in terms of the other sectors, the ISP world is still very active in terms of buying. They're building networks. They continue to add customers. This is, I think, if you look globally, the largest quantities of unconnected communities are still in Africa and in the APNIC region. But even in the US, where internet penetration is sort of in the 95+% range for households, we're still seeing ISPs buying addresses. Okay. So that's and these are people sort of who are building the networks that Geoff is suggesting maybe sort of overcome technologically by the push of CDNs closer to the end consumer.
So what about the market longevity? I mean, we're seeing the demand trends with talks of NATs. There's IPv6 take-up, as you just pointed out, and Geoff was talking about other emerging infrastructure or network architecture trends that could be there in the future. Even will there even be a need in the future for unique addresses? So what are some of your thoughts? I'll open it up to anyone on the market longevity.
So when you think about the whole infrastructure thing, IP transit, also the hyperscalers, we see the trend that actually, ISPs and hyperscalers are expanding, and they are the majority part of the internet infrastructure. Then we have, all the CDNs and whatnot. What I see here that, when we look at ISPs implementing NAT solution into their network, I think it's definitely a smart move to do, because this is how we can, utilize IPv4 addresses efficiently. Well, but there is another, aside where you have different type of technical issues, where performance, and scalability things. So, but again, having in mind that hyperscalers are actually taking over the hosting industry, let's put it this way, we should definitely think how the IP address as such could become IP as a service type of thing, where it would be easy even to announce your IP space, in never mind any of the infrastructure provider. Is it a hyperscaler? Is it a data center? Or is it just a cloud provider? So that's kind of my thoughts on that.
But Gabe, are you seeing kind of, in a way, what they are, and the question that we pose is IPv4 a commodity? Are we seeing, large scale, financial buyers entering the market and going, I believe that like real estate, the value of this is going to go up. In the meantime, I can get a good rental every month. It's very much like real estate. Is that something that's happened? Are people saying, parts of my investment portfolio now, maybe I'll have some Bitcoin in there, I'll have some IPv4 addresses, I'll have some real estate, I'll have some stocks and shares.
Absolutely.
Is that what people? Is that what we're seeing as well through both these markets?
We have private equity and private funds who actually diversify their assets, and some of them actually are more focused on crypto, but we also differentiate. Perhaps we will buy some IP addresses that we can monetize, which is a good thing as well, and we would increase that utilization and effectiveness of that IP usage, which is a good thing.
So what we've seen, I think that the transfer rules are mostly designed to avoid sort of purely speculative behavior. So it's very difficult to buy addresses, take sort of title, if you will, to them, and turn around and sell them in 30 or 60 days time. Most of the regions prohibit that activity. That said, the utilization through leasing creates a legitimate use in the eyes of the registries. So then you're into the real estate discussion, which I think is a valuable analogy. You buy the asset, you lease it out for a period of time, and then the goal is to sell it at some future date for more than you paid for it, and that I don't think we're not seeing, for example, financial institutions get directly into that business, but to the extent that they are investing in businesses that do that indirectly, I think you'll see flows of capital that going in that direction. But all that being said, if you take a look at the global marketplace for addresses, and you look at the number of addresses that have, even if you ignore the number of addresses that trade annually, the global market potential is, let's say it's 4 billion, and you're at $50 an address, so it's a $200 billion market. It is still, for financial firms, a fairly small total addressable marketplace relative to many other commodities. It's
That's
nothing
true.
compared.
That's true. Yes, that's true.
So for sure, and that, the number of participants who actually understand how the marketplace works is in the hundreds, maybe globally, maybe a few thousand, and so this is not easy to for people to focus on if directly in at a trading desk at Credit Suisse or UBS or Goldman Sachs. I don't think anybody wants to pay attention to this, but the private equity firms, for example, for sure, many of them have understand that these addresses are inside their portfolio companies, and so many of them are aware that this is a real marketplace. It has real rules. It attracts real capital. The value of what gets bought and sold every month is not trivial. I think going back to what Geoff said about, what is the motivator that drives people to look elsewhere for alternatives, price is a significant one. If you have to pay, $100 or $200 an address, then you may look at, what are my options? At some point, it starts to get quite expensive. Those options could be a different financial structure, but those options could also be alternate technologies. And I think everybody views natting as an imperfect way to extend the address space.
So I know we're running out of time. Just one for you, something you brought up earlier, Gabe, and I'm sure a lot of small businesses out there would rather that IPv4 addresses were free so that they could just get their businesses off the ground and not let that stand in the way. I think that's something Diego was getting at. But it doesn't seem to be the case. There is a market out there. As you said, some of them probably see the amounts they're paying now at 50 an IP probably relatively small to their entire operation of getting the startup off the ground. Do you think there's a roof to this market? When does it become too big a hurdle? And maybe just a double barrel question to save time. Would you consider the IPv4 market to be volatile?
So the short answer to the first question is it depends on the market you're operating in. So if you are operating in a market where your annual revenue per user, is in the tens of dollars, then $100 might be per address, might actually price you out of the market if you were thinking about starting a company at the from zero. If your annual revenue per user is in the hundreds or thousands of dollars, then I think the ceiling is way above where we are today. And then as it relates to volatility, sometimes this market has been flat, but most of the time the price is rising. And where we see variation in the prices that people actually pay, it mostly has to do with the seller's sense of what they're willing to take. And I don't believe that this is volatile in the sense that, there will be a moment in the next, 5 or 10 years where we're going to see over a 2 or 3 month period of time a 20% drop in pricing, because it's not a speculative asset, and you would have to be holding addresses and quickly wanting to redeploy your capital into another asset for that to happen. And that's not so far, that's not the way this market has worked.
Okay, well, then let me throw a potential scenario at you. What happens if the US Department of Defense decided to dump a couple of /8s on the market?
So good question, right? So the supply and demand dynamic is such that if you flood the market with supply, then the price will go down. So in the short term, for sure, prices would take a hit. The number of entities that can actually digest that space, and if the Department of Defense wants to start selling that off in /20s, It would completely destroy market pricing for a period of time. But remember, the people who are buying these addresses are also deploying them, and they're committing to that technology for a period of time. So the demand will continue unabated in the near term. I think the market can soak up a several /8s a year in addition to what's currently being transacted now. And the buyers and sellers of /20s and 19s and 16s even, they might see a little bit of a decline in price, but the demand continues to grow. So, if you go, if Geoff were on, he would tell you that the market would soak that up pretty quickly, I'm sure.
Okay.
The market, so short-term volatility for flood of supply, absolutely. Long-term, does it change anything in the way people think about addresses? I don't think so.
Okay, gentlemen, I think I'm going to wrap up. I've been told to keep it to the hour, and I'm going to do that. So, I guess the final thoughts, listening to it and using the real estate property analogy, I guess you can either buy it, you can sell, rent it, or you can do nothing with it. And there's also always a danger that someone might squat that property that you have. And that happens in the V4 markets as well. So, look, thank you all for this. I think, there's probably enough interest. There was quite a few people tuning in that we might have a follow-up on this. We might get some different people to take a different view. I know there were points of Diego about the moral issues of doing this or not. I think there are wider discussions that go on also at the IRRs and their communities. But thank you all, gentlemen, for your time and giving us your expertise for this one. I hope everyone enjoyed it. It will be made available, I think, by tomorrow if you do want to download it or share it with anyone. And I'm sure we'll have a follow-up to this. So thank you all for tuning in. There was another IPXO webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, Serge, for moderation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.